Rufus stood at the subway steps, looking down. For a wonder, especially at this hour, there was no one on the steps. The steps were empty. He wondered if the man in the booth would change his $5 bill. He started down. Then as the man gave him change, and he began to move toward the turnstile, other people came, rushing and loud, pushing past him as though they were swimmers, and he nothing but an upright pole in the water. Then something began to awaken in him, something new. It increased his distance. It increased his pain. They were rushing to the platform, to the tracks. Something he had not thought of for many years, something he had never ceased to think of, came back to him as he walked behind the crowd. The subway platform was a dangerous place. So he had always thought. It sloped downward toward the waiting tracks. And when he had been a little boy and stood on the platform beside his mother, he had not dared let go her hand. He stood on the platform now, alone with all these people, who were each of them alone, and waited in a quiet calmness for the train. But suppose something somewhere failed, and the yellow lights went out, and no one could see any longer the platform's edge. Suppose these beams fell down. He saw the train in the tunnel, rushing underwater, the motorman gone mad, gone blind, unable to decipher the lights, and the tracks gleaming and snarling senselessly upward forever, the train never stopping, and the people screaming at windows and doors and turning on each other with all the accumulated fury of their blasphemed lives, everything gone out of them but murder, breaking limb from limb and splashing in blood with joy. For the first time, joy. Joy, after such a long sentence in chains, leaping out to astound the world again. Or the train in the tunnel, the water outside, the power failing, the walls coming in, and the water not rising like a flood but breaking like a wave over the heads of these people, filling their crying mouths, filling their eyes, their hair, tearing away their clothes, and discovering the secrecy which only the water by now could use. It could happen. It could happen, and he would have loved to see it happen, even if he perished too. The train came in, filling the great scar of the tracks. They all got in, sitting in the lighted car, which was far from empty, which would be choked with people before they got very far uptown, and stood or sat in the isolation cell into which they transformed every inch of space they held. The train stopped at 14th Street. Rufus was sitting at the window, and he watched a few people get on. There was a colored girl among them who looked a little like his sister, but she looked at him and looked away and sat down as far from him as she could. The train rolled on through the tunnel. The next stop was 34th Street. People got on. He watched the stop roll by. 42nd Street. This time a crowd got on, some of them carrying papers, and there were no seats left. A white man leaned on a strap near him. Rufus felt his gorge rise. At 59th Street, many came on board, and many rushed across the platform to the waiting local. Many white people and many black people, chained together in time and in space and by history, and all of them in a hurry to get away from each other, he thought. But we ain't never going to make it. We've been fucked for fair. Then the door slammed, a loud sound, and it made Rufus jump. The train, as though protesting its heavier burden, as though protesting the proximity of white buttock to black knee, groaned, lurched. The wheels seemed to scrape the track, making a tearing sound. Then it began to move uptown, where the masses would divide and the load become lighter. Lights flared and teetered by. They passed other platforms where people waited for other trains. Then they had the tunnel to themselves. The train rushed into the blackness with a phallic abandon, into the blackness which opened to receive it. Opened. The whole world shook with their coupling. Then, when it seemed that the roar and the movement would never cease, they came into the bright lights of 125th Street. The train gasped and moaned to a halt. He had thought that he would get off here, but he watched the people move toward the doors, watched the doors open, watched them leave. It was mainly black people who left. He had thought that he would get off here and go home, but he watched the girl who reminded him of his sister as she moved sullenly past white people and stood for a moment on the platform before walking toward the steps. Suddenly he knew that he was never going home anymore. The train began to move, half empty now, and with each stop it became lighter. Soon the white people who were left looked at him oddly. He felt their stares, but he felt far away from them. You took the best, so why not take the rest? He got off at the station named for the bridge he built to honor the father of his country, and walked up the steps into the streets, which were empty. Tall apartment buildings, lightless, loomed against the dark sky and seemed to be watching him, seemed to be pressing down on him. The bridge was nearly over his head, intolerably high, but he did not yet see the water. He felt it, he smelled it. He thought how he had never before understood how an animal could smell water. But it was over there, past the highway, where he could see the speeding cars. Then he stood on the bridge, looking over, looking down. Now the lights of the cars on the highway seemed to be writing an endless message, writing with awful speed in a fine, unreadable script. There were muted lights on the Jersey shore, and here and there neon flame advertising something somebody had for sale. He began to walk slowly to the center of the bridge, observing that from this height, the city which had been so dark as he walked through it seemed to be on fire. He stood at the center of the bridge, and it was freezing cold. He raised his eyes to heaven. He thought, you bastard, you motherfucking bastard. Ain't I your baby, too? He began to cry. Something in Rufus which could not break shook him like a rag doll and splashed salt water all over his face and filled his throat and his nostrils with anguish. He knew the pain would never stop. He could never go down into the city again. He dropped his head as though someone had struck him and looked down at the water. It was cold, and the water would be cold. He was black, and the water was black. He lifted himself by his hands on the rail, lifted himself as high as he could, and leaned far out. The wind tore at him, at his head and shoulders, while something in him screamed, why, why? He thought of Eric. His straining arms threatened to break. I can't make it this way. He thought of Ida. He whispered, I'm sorry, Leona. And then the wind took him. He felt himself going over, head down. The wind, the stars, the lights, the water, all rolled together. All right. He felt a shoe fly off behind him. There was nothing around him, only the wind. All right, you motherfucking God almighty bastard, I'm coming to you. Some of you know me, and some of you don't. My name is Reverend Foster. And I know some of your faces, and some of you are strangers to me. He made a brief bow, first toward Cass, then toward Vivaldo. But ain't none of us really strangers. We all here for the same reason. Someone we loved is dead. He paused again and looked down at the beer. Someone we loved and laughed with and talked with and got mad at and prayed over is gone. He ain't with us no more. He's gone someplace where the wicked cease from troubling. He looked down at the beer again. We ain't gonna look on his face again. No more. He had a hard time getting through this world. And he had a rough time getting out of it. When he stand before his Maker, he's gonna look like a lot of us looked when we first got here. Like he had a rough time getting to the passage. It was narrow. He cleared his throat and blew his nose. I ain't gonna stand here and tell you all a whole lot of lies about Rufus. I don't believe in that. I used to know Rufus. I knew him all his life. He was a bright kid, and he was full of the devil, and we're no way in the world of keeping up with him. He got in a lot of trouble. All of you know that. A lot of our boys get in a lot of trouble, and some of you know why. We used to talk about it sometimes, him and me. We was always pretty good friends, Rufus and me, even after he jumped up and ran off from here. And even though he didn't never attend church service like we always wanted him to. He had to go his way. He had his trouble, and he's gone. He was young, he was bright, he was beautiful. We expected great things from him. But he's gone away from us now, and it's us who have to make the great things happen. I believe I know how terrible some of you feel. I know how terrible I feel. Ain't nothing I can say gonna take away that ache, not right away. But that boy was one of the best men I ever met, and I've been around a while. I ain't gonna try to judge him. That ain't for us to do. You know, a lot of people say that a man who takes his own life oughtn't to be buried in holy ground. I don't know nothing about that. All I know, God made every bit of ground I ever walked on, and everything God made is holy. And don't none of us know what goes on in the heart of someone. Don't many of us know what's going on in our own hearts, for the matter of that, and so can't none of us say why he did what he did. Ain't none of us been there, and so don't none of us know. We got to pray that the Lord will receive him like we pray that the Lord's going to receive us. That's all. That's all. And I tell you something else. Don't none of you forget it. I know a lot of people that took their own lives. And they're walking up and down the streets today. And some of them is preaching the gospel. And some is sitting in the seats of the mighty. Now you remember that. If the world wasn't so full of dead folks, maybe those of us that's trying to live wouldn't have to suffer so bad. He walked up and down behind the altar, behind the bier. I know there ain't nothing I can say to you that sit before me. His mother and father, his sister, his kinfolks, his friends, to bring him back or to keep you from grieving that he's gone. I know that. Ain't nothing I can say will make his life different, make it the life that maybe some other man might have lived. It's all been done. It's all written down on high. But don't lose heart, dear ones. Don't lose heart. Don't let it make you bitter. Try to understand. Try to understand. The world's already bitter enough. We got to try to be better than the world. Look down, then over to the front row. You got to remember, he said gently, that he was trying. Ain't many trying, and all that tries must suffer. Be proud of him. You got a right to be proud. And that's all he ever wanted in this world. Except for someone, a man, weeping in the front row. There was silence all over the chapel. Cass thought that the man must be Rufus's father, and she wondered if he believed what the preacher said. What had Rufus been to him? A troublesome son, a stranger while living, and now a stranger forever in death. Whatever else had been, or might have been, locked in Rufus's heart, or in the heart of his father, had gone into oblivion with Rufus. It would never be expressed now. It was over.